Since there's a new expansion coming out, it's another very pivotal time for the game, especially since the number of subscribers isn't at its peak amount anymore. I think it's time for a look back at what World of Warcraft has been, what it is now, what the game has lost over the years, and what it's gained. Of course, it's also a pivotal time for my favorite class, so I will be focusing a lot, though not exclusively, on paladins. And it's a pivotal time for my favorite profession, engineering, so it'll get some focus too. Here's my plan. I'm going to go through vanilla and then through each of the game's expansions and look at multiple facets of the game and how they've evolved over time. Here are the things that I want to look at. Game progression, the Paladin Seal and Judgment system, the Paladin On-Demand Ability Kit, Paladin heals, auras and blessings, and engineering. Hopefully, all this will give you an impression of how the game has gotten to the point where it is. First of all, vanilla's progression was, in a word, difficult. There were no heroics, quests never rewarded any gear above green level ever, so pretty much your only source for player versus environment gear was the auction house, random drops from bosses in dungeons, and later on, raids. It's worth adding, there was no emblem system, there was no system of justice or valor points, so the random number gods held strong sway over the population. All of this was made worse by the fact that there was no looking for group auto-match system at all in vanilla. You had to stay in a city, keep typing looking for group in the same chat, and hope someone will say invite me, and also hope that the person you just invited was actually competent. Not to mention, you also had to hope that whoever you invited had skills that meshed with the things that the characters already in your group were already bringing to the table. It was a harsh world in comparison of World of Warcraft today, and in an environment without LFG matchmaking, having friends and guildmates who will help you clear out a dungeon was a big help. Looking back on it now, I had some pretty close World of Warcraft friends back in those days, and I realized the thing that drove us together as WoW friends was the fact that we had to band together to stand up in a difficult environment like that. Because it was so difficult to so much as get into a dungeon, let alone beat the bosses, let alone have the random number gods smile upon you, I can sum up the gear situation with 3 words. Stuff was rare. If you were lucky enough to get a blue or even a purple item, it was really a big feather in your hat and made things feel very rewarding. And yes, getting blues was hard back then. A casual player like me actually ended vanilla with cloth greens because that was all I could get my hands on that could actually help me heal. That was how hard it was to gear up. These days it's no problem to deck your character out in purples that were actually made for your class for that matter, even if you're not in a guild, so it's not quite as rewarding as it was in vanilla. That feeling of having something rewarding is something that WoW has lost over the years, and while I think it's a good thing that the game and most of its content has become much more accessible, I also think it would be a good idea for Blizzard to make the rewards from the game's harder content feel more rewarding. It's worth adding that the way the game is now, it doesn't really feel like you have no place left to go but into the most difficult content once you beat looking for raid. Back in vanilla, the only places you could go for PvE content once you hit level 60 was into dungeons or raids, and those were hard to get into. The fact that there was this I have no place to go but into the difficult places feeling in vanilla actually pushed players, even casuals like me, to go into these harder bits of content every now and again. And while I did have some leather, mail, and cloth greens on me when the Burning Crusade came out, I was walking around proudly sporting a purple shield for molten core for my troubles. That felt so rewarding that even today I transmogrify my spell shield into the drill bore disc. Visually, the blue and green items from back then weren't nearly as spectacular as the ones today. Heck, even purples from then look like today's grays. Yes, you'll see people walking around with transmog gear from back then, probably because that gear tended to give your character a solid color. But on the whole, vanilla's weapons and armor were made to look realistic and were designed to be the kinds of things you'd expect someone to carry if they were in a fantasy setting. Nowadays, the weapons are all made to look as flashy and impressive as can be. That's led to an oversaturation of flashy and impressive gear, and that has had the effect of making the game feel less rewarding. Even if you beat the hardest boss on Heroic and get the best weapon in the game off of it, the only effect that has visually is that your weapon is a different color from the casual player who beat his easy version in looking for raid, and since everything is flashing and glowing with particle effects these days, it's not likely people will even notice your Heroic weapon anyway. Anyhow, returning to the Vanilla's progression. Most of the game's content revolved around getting your character up to level 60. There was a huge world to explore in getting that far, with deserts, jungles, forests, swamps, rocky wastelands, areas devoured by magical blight, cliffs and mountains and oceans of every description you can imagine appearing in nature. There were some quests with a little localized storytelling that explained what the official alliance or horde officers were attempting to accomplish in a given area, but for the most part the game was like a big open sandbox where you never knew what was around the corner. Once you hit level 60, there was still some content for you. Early on in the game, there were a lot of 10-man dungeons for level 60 players. Stratholme, Scholomance, Upper and Lower Blackrock Spire, those all started out as 10-mans. They were a doozy to get people for if you weren't in a guild, of course, which might have been part of the reason why Blizzard retooled those instances into 5-man dungeons, even as far back as Vanilla. After that, there were two separate lines of progression. One for 20-man raids, which included things like Zul'Gurub and the ruins of Ahn'Qiraj, and one for 20-man raids, which included the Molten Core where Ragnaros was, Onyxia's Lair, and Dragonwing Lair. In each case, you had to get your character's gear up to a certain level so your character would be powerful enough to take on the next leg of the progression. In that sense, cutting-edge progression wasn't that much different then from what it is now. But without looking for raid, a lot of people never got a chance to see what that progression was like. Hopefully all this gives you some idea what World of Warcraft felt like overall, and what context players found themselves in back in 2004 to 2007. If you hopped in a time machine and went back to then, the game would be unrecognizable. Probably the class that would be the most unrecognizable of them all would be the class that has been my main for 9 years now, the paladin class. There were so many ways we're different and better now than what we were back then. Probably the best illustration of that is what Paladin's abilities were back then. Scrolling through the list of Paladin spells from 2005, you'll notice there's a lot missing. No Crusader Strike, no Divine Storm, no Templar's Verdict, no Hammer of the Righteous, no Denounce, not even Hammer of Wrath. All those came later in the game, and they were added bit by bit over the course of the last 9 years. If you're asking yourself, so what was our rotation like back then? The answer is simple. In Vanilla, we did not have a rotation. Blizzard's whole philosophy with the Paladin class's design could be summed up as follows. If Paladins have a buff on them so that their auto attacks hit enemies with some extra holy damage 10 times per minute on the average, that is exactly the same as giving Paladins a holy strike ability with a 6-second cooldown timer. Apparently this idea made sense to Blizzard, and it was their idea of making Paladins unique and preventing homogenization. They added a lot of chance-on-hit buffs to Paladins, and you could pick one to keep active on yourself. That was, and to a lesser extent still is, our seal system. Admittedly, these seals had some fun and useful effects on them, but the sheer fact that you're not doing anything besides refreshing buffs on yourself that meant that combat wasn't that interactive at all, and it was not a fun system. There was one thing in the seal system that broke up the monotony a little. At the time, Judgment was an ability that consumed the seal you had active on yourself and turned it into an effect on your target. It had a 15-second cooldown at the time that was never buffed to less than 10 seconds in Vanilla, and, with the exception of Seal of Righteousness, which was our only baseline direct damage seal at the time, it generally converted a buff on you into a debuff on the enemy. Again, there was a vast array of debuffs, many of which were fun, useful, or even vital. At the time, Judgment of Wisdom meant that any player who hits your target gets a little mana. This was terrific for long fights, and there were phases during boss fights in Vanilla where your casters had to use their wands to attack a judged target so that they could replenish their mana, and once they get enough mana back, then they can continue the fight normally. Yes, these buffs and debuffs were mostly useful, but because there were no strikes, no rotation, and generally nothing to do, it was a terrible system. You're probably thinking, wait, Longrider, I saw Exorcism and Holy Wrath. You can't tell me those didn't give us something to do. Well, funny story. Exorcism and Holy Wrath had completely different purposes then from what they have now. Nowadays, Exorcism is a ranged retribution spell whose cooldown depends on procs. Back then, Exorcism was specifically an anti-undead tool that dealt a good chunk of damage, but it could only target undead, and was later buffed to be able to target demons too. These days, Holy Wrath is a protection-specific, short-range, short cooldown AoE damage button. Back then it was, you guessed it, an anti-undead cooldown with a 20-yard range that dealt massive damage to and stunned everything in the area. If it was undead. If you were fighting undead, yeah, the monotony could be broken up and you did feel badass, but versus anything else? Boring. Clearly paladins were envisioned as a class that specialized in fighting undead, but this was not a good thing, since it made their combat against anything else weak and boring. The lack of on-demand damage and threat-generating options was one of two things that made it impossible for paladins to tank anything that wasn't undead. We had no taunts, and the only reliable threat-generating tools were clunky in design and implementation, and those tools went away when the paladin-specific patch rolled around. And if you wanted to do anything at range, you were pretty much out of luck. Judgment had a 5-yard range that was never buffed to more than 10 yards in vanilla, regardless of the fact that it was just applying debuffs most of the time. You'd think Blizzard would say, okay, this is just applying a debuff that lets your group get mana back, so let's allow these paladins to cast it from the back of the raid where they're going to be anyway since they're healing. Blizzard didn't have the decency to give us even that as a ranged ability. The other part of their philosophy with paladins was that we were almost exclusively a melee-only class. I say almost because there was one general-purpose, on-demand ranged spell paladins could get. Holy Shock. Holy Paladins are probably thinking, oh, I love Holy Shock. It's got a 6-second cooldown, it deals a ton of damage. Something like that would totally break the monotony up, right? Wrong. In vanilla, Holy Shock had a 30-second cooldown, dealt low damage, cost a ton of mana, couldn't even heal until after the Paladin patch, and to add insult to injury, it was in the deepest part of the Holy Tree. And yes, they put a plus strength talent deep in the Holy Tree too. It really makes you wonder what they were thinking. So, there were no on-demand damage options, no ranged spells. The only things paladins had going for them was their vast array of buffs, both for helping themselves and their allies, and their very mana-efficient and low-threat heals. Take a good look at these blessings and auras, because the vast majority of them are going to slowly go away as expansions come out. If you're holy and didn't play back then, you're probably asking, where are Divine Light, Holy Radiance, and Word of Glory? None of those existed in vanilla. We had no group heals to speak of besides Judgment of Light, which was a lot like Judgment of Wisdom except it healed the raid a little. Judgment of Light was nowhere near as good as things like Prayer of Healing and Chain Heal, but it can be said that our single-target heals were very mana-efficient, and often in a long fight a paladin would have plenty of mana while priests and druids were completely out. At this point, you're probably getting a good idea for why I felt like I had to make the Does Blizzard Really Hate Paladins series, and over the course of this series you'll see why I felt like I had to make Does Blizzard Really Hate Gnomish Engineers too. Funny thing is, Blizzard clearly did not hate engineering in vanilla. There was a wide variety of guns, bombs, trinkets, and gimmicky, specialized tools that helped in combat and could fill in the gaps that your class's kit left gaping open. Dynamite had a wide, ranged AoE damage, bombs and grenades had brief stuns, the Gnomish Death Ray could deal a ton of damage, there were rocket boots that gave you a sprint-like ability. Who wouldn't want to get this stuff? Since the Paladin kit left so many gaping holes that engineering could fill, I felt like I had to become an engineer in order to function. Besides, look at all this other cool stuff engineers could make. Sadly, most expansions didn't have nearly so much cool stuff, but I'm getting ahead of myself by saying that. One thing that ties engineering into the issues with progression is that one of the things that made professions and progression satisfying was the fact that sometimes blueprints would drop in dungeons or raids or could even be found on the floor in dungeons. That meant that going into the difficult content would get you a chance to be able to craft awesome items, which were as much a status symbol as the flashy gear that dropped from bosses. My experience is that recipes don't drop off of bosses anymore, which is one of the things that makes the game feel a little less rewarding. That about wraps it up for vanilla. Yeah, I glossed over a few things, but I think I hit the most important points. Next time we'll be seeing what the Burning Crusade did for progression, paladins, and engineering.